Hey, come look at the site.
Oh, cool. Can you download the Foo Fighters?
Yeah. Hold on.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today I want to talk about the impact of piracy on the music industry. Now, this is a topic that's obviously been debated a million times before, so you might think that I'm beating a dead horse, but actually I think now is the perfect time to have this conversation again. And the reason why I say that is because the rise of the whole streaming ecosystem, which really has only come online in the last 3 or 4 years, has completely changed the game. And whatever you thought about piracy 10 or even 5 years ago may not be true in 2019. And because of that, we really couldn't answer the question of how piracy affected the industry until now. Basically, what I think happened was this. Piracy brought the industry to the brink of death. It was saved by streaming, which is great, but ironically, we wouldn't have streaming if we didn't have piracy. It may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but stay tuned. I'm going to explain the whole thing in the video. Before I get into it, just really quickly, I would love it if you give me a follow over on Instagram. I've been posting there a lot more lately. There's a link in the description, so if you like this video or any of my other videos, please give me a follow over there. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1, a brief history of music piracy. I kind of divide music piracy into 3 eras. The first era is the physical copy era, and I'm sure if piracy goes back even further than this, there are probably people bootlegging sheet music back in the 1850s or something, but the early days of piracy, as far as I'm aware of, goes back to the 80s and the 90s, when piracy meant that you had to make an actual physical copy of the album. And believe it or not, back in the 80s, the major label side of the industry was freaked out about blank tapes. This was their big concern at the time. Like the blank cassettes that you can buy at CVS for $1.50 or whatever, because you can pop those into your cassette deck at home and record whatever you want onto them, including a copy of another tape, a vinyl LP, or a CD. They were convinced that home taping would destroy the industry, which A, is kind of funny and adorable in hindsight, considering how the next era of piracy actually did nearly destroy the industry, and B, it shows you they've always been operating from a very fearful place when it comes to piracy. Their response to any new kind of piracy vector has always been to try to kill it rather than adapt to it. As one example of this, and also an example of how indie and DIY artists have usually felt a lot less threatened by piracy, I remember getting this Circle Jerks tape when I was in 7th grade, I think, which would have been 1990 or 91. You can see here, it's a one-sided tape. Side 1 has the album, and then side 2 is blank, and it says, you can put whatever you want on this side and ruin the music business in the privacy of your own home. And if you're old like me, then you probably did the same thing back then as me and my friends did. One of us would buy the album, and then we would let everybody else borrow it and make a cassette copy of it. But that had to be done in real time. So if the album was 45 minutes long, it took you 45 minutes to make a copy of it. Unless you were doing a cassette-to-cassette copy using the setting that was common back then called high-speed dubbing that did it in basically half the time. And I'm pretty sure that feature was designed specifically to facilitate piracy. And there's one part of this era that I want to highlight because I think it kind of foreshadows a similar dynamic in how file sharing worked a few years later, and that is the tape trading scene. Basically, there was this scene of people all over the world who would trade copied cassettes with each other, which was technically piracy, I guess, but that wasn't really what it was all about. These people weren't trading copies of major label artists because they wanted to get free music. These were super fans of underground metal and punk, trading copies of obscure demos and 7-inches with the goal of just sharing the music and getting more people into the bands that they loved. It wasn't about getting free stuff, and the bands were also cool with it because it helped them reach a bigger audience than they could on their own. The tape traders would have lists of all the titles in their collection. They'd send those lists to each other and request copies of whatever they wanted. And by doing that, they would assemble their own collection of copied tapes that they would then share with the rest of the tape trading scene. And it would just kind of grow from there. Like, I'd get your list and I would see that you had the Morbid Angel and Incantation demos, and I would trade you copies of those for copies of the Obituary and Creator demos that I had. That was how underground bands built a following back then, and it was happening all through the mail, like actually putting cassettes into an envelope with stamps on it. And kind of a funny little ironic note, one of the people who was really into tape trading was Lars Ulrich, and the tape trading scene was actually one of the keys to building Metallica's early fan base, as well as key to building up a few other bands you may have heard of like Slayer, Megadeth, and Sepultura, among many, many others. But by the time the late 90s rolled around, CD burners had gotten affordable and they replaced tapes as the medium of choice for piracy. And although the medium had changed, it was still the same dynamic of one person buys the album and everybody else copies it. If you were around back then you probably remember the days of having a CD binder full of burned CDs with the name written on them in Sharpie that you would bring around in the car or to school with your Discman or whatever. But anyhow, the main thing here to remember is that because you had to go to the trouble of actually making a physical copy of everything that you wanted, it really limited the scale of piracy. I'm sure there's a few freaky weirdos of the basement full of 25,000 tapes that they had copied, but for most people, you'd have maybe a few dozen, because who really wants to go to the trouble of copying hundreds or thousands of tapes, right? So whatever impact piracy had was mitigated by that. But with that said, I think this era established a dynamic that would continue to be true. Piracy was hated and feared by the music industry establishment, and mostly for good reason, because from their perspective, it really was just a way for people to get music without paying for it. And on the other hand, piracy was tolerated or even encouraged by the indie and DIY scene because they saw it as a discovery vehicle. To them, it was a marketing tool. Which brings us to era number 2, the peer-to-peer era. You could maybe also call this the golden age of music piracy, because for those of us who had a huge appetite for music but not a lot of money, this was an amazing time and I have a lot of fond memories from it. The defining moment for this era, and maybe the most game-changing thing to happen in the music industry in general since the debut of MTV back in 1980 or whenever it was the launch of Napster in 1999. Many of you guys are probably familiar with Napster, I'm sure, but as I write this, I'm realizing it was 20 years ago, which means that a lot of people watching this probably never used it for themselves, so I'll just briefly explain what it was. Napster was the first peer-to-peer file sharing application, or at least the first one to get any kind of real traction. Certainly the first one I ever heard of. There were other ways to download music before, turbo nerd stuff like IRC and Usenet, and I was a big Usenet guy, but Napster was the first application that was easy to use for non-technical people. Basically, the way it worked was that you would share all the MP3s on your computer, everybody else did the same, and you could search everybody else's shared files basically the same way as if they were on your computer, and then just download whatever you wanted. It's a really simple concept, but it was totally revolutionary at the time because it made almost any music you could think of just a search away.
I'll think of a song and I'll run back to my desk and write down the song so I can come home. I have my little list right here of all the songs I need to get on Napster tonight.
It was not terribly different from what the Spotify experience is now, except of course a lot clunkier because we weren't as good at designing applications back then and internet speeds were way worse, but fundamentally a pretty similar kind of experience. And I discovered a lot of great music on Napster. My favorite thing to do was to search for a band that I liked, like say NoFX or whatever, and then I would click on one of the people sharing it, browse their entire library of shared files, and just download random bands to check out. Kind of along the same lines of browsing somebody's Spotify playlist. And as someone with a limitless appetite for new music back then, I was like a kid in a candy store. I filled up so many hard drives and CDRs with MP3s that I got off Napster, like I couldn't even begin to count them. Like I said before, accumulating thousands of copied tapes or CDs was kind of a chore, but downloading thousands of albums on Napster was pretty easy. And so Napster spread like crazy, especially on college campuses because they had good internet connections in their dorm rooms. Because remember, back then the majority of people were still on a dial-up connection when it would take several minutes or maybe even more to download a single MP3. And at its peak, Napster had 80 million users, which is actually pretty insane considering that there were way less people in general on the internet back then, and Spotify, I think, just crossed the 80 million subscriber mark in the US last year. And just like they freaked out about blank tapes in the 80s and blank CDs in the 90s, the major labels and established artists were very, very unhappy about Napster, to say the least. The most well-known example of that being Lars Ulrich, who, as a lot of you guys probably know, was very vocal about his opposition to Napster.
Hello? Hey, frat boy.
What the hell do you think you're doing, man?
Holy crap!
And although it's kind of cringy and embarrassing the way he went about it, from the perspective of an artist like Metallica, I actually get it. Napster was hurting them. It did hurt the sales of major label albums. There's just no question about that. I mean, look at this chart here of music industry revenue. Look what happens after 1999 when Napster comes out. It's just down, 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 down. And Napster was effectively shut down in 2001. I think it technically still exists in some weird form or another, but basically it was shut down in 2001, but many alternatives popped up to replace it. Most of them didn't last very long either because nobody figured out the legal side of it, nobody figured out how to monetize it, and I thought it'd be fun to talk about a few of these that I remember. Let me know in the comments which one was your favorite. First up, Limewire. It was basically the same thing as Napster from like a user experience perspective, but as I recall, it added the ability to share videos and zip files so you could also pirate movies and software on Limewire. Audiogalaxy. I don't hear a lot of people talk about this one, but it was actually a really cool, like, community-based concept that sort of revolved around these forums that were actually pretty active. I remember the guitarist of the Red Chord being on one of the video game OST boards on there all the time. Morpheus and Kazaa. I'm lumping these two together because, as I recall, they were based on the same protocol. Kazaa was very popular. I used it for a little bit, but I got a few nasty viruses on my Windows XP machine back then, swore off it, and never used Kazaa again.
Caution. A virus has been detected.
DC++. This is another less common one. I mostly use Direct Connect to get Dreamcast games. Shout out to the glory days of Dreamcast piracy for anybody who was around back then. And Soulseek. Soulseek was always the hipster file sharing app of choice, popular with like the emo types, and from what I understand, it kind of still is that way. I think I remember Billy from Seisha being into it, so maybe that's why the Scrams nerds still use it. I don't know. And last but definitely not least, I also have to give a shout out to the piracy outlet that refuses to die, the sketchy Russian and Brazilian blogspots with ad-gated links to MediaFire files that were deleted in 2011. But anyhow, I think the rise of BitTorrent just kind of killed all those file-sharing apps. As I recall, everybody pretty much moved their piracy over to torrents by the mid to late 2000s. But still, the cat was out of the bag. The platforms continued to change, but piracy just kept growing and growing and growing. And once again, as much as the major labels and established artists hated piracy, mostly for good reason, smaller artists took advantage of it and used it as a way to get discovered. Here's the one and only legendary Soulja Boy talking about how he used Limewire at the beginning of his career as a marketing tool.
I upload Crank That to Limewire and I title it 50 Cent in the Club. Britney Spears, wooty wooty woo. Eminem, do da 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 da. Whoever the fuck was popping at that time. They hit download, they hit play, it go, you don't. So they're like, what the fuck is this about? You know what I'm saying? About probably like a minute in, they're like, damn, this shit hard. And they, who the fuck is Soulja Boy? And
now, before I move on, I should actually be clear that although I've obviously done my fair share of pirating back in the day, I actually don't support piracy. And speaking of which, I actually haven't really pirated anything in a long time because as soon as Spotify came along in 2011, there was really no reason to pirate music anymore.
What'd I do? You know it's illegal, download copyrighted music. I'm taking you in.
Which brings us to era number 3, the streaming era. Like I said, these days there's really no good reason to pirate music other than something that's out of print and not available on any of the streaming or download services. For example, an old demo or 7-inch or something like that that's been out of print since 1982. Because Spotify and to a lesser extent, Apple Music are basically the perfected version of all those old P2P apps like Napster and Kazaa. Any song you could think of is just a search away, and unlike the P2P apps back in the day, you don't have to worry about low quality audio, about mistagged files like Soulja Boy's. You don't have to worry about viruses, any of that stuff. And also, a month of Spotify or Apple Music is actually a lot cheaper than buying a single CD back in the day. Because remember, CDs sometimes were as much as like $16 or $17, which is just insane to me. And because of that, I've been a subscriber since Spotify launched in the US back in 2011, and I've never looked back. I can't really imagine listening to music any other way. In my opinion, it's never been a better time to be a music fan because now you have the best of all worlds. You've got the massive on-demand library that we've grown to expect in the post-Napster era, but now you can access that library without breaking the law or screwing the copyright holder. So as far as I'm concerned, this basically brings us to the end of music piracy, unless something changes and for whatever reason Kazaa comes back from the grave, in which case I'll have to make an updated version of this video. But anyway, now that we're all on the same page as far as the history of piracy, or at least my version of it, that brings us to the most important part and the real focus of this video, which is part 2. Did piracy help or hurt the industry? And like I said in the intro to this video, I think there's no single answer to whether it helped or hurt the industry. The answer to that question, I think, largely depends on who you are. And before I get into the details, I think this chart does a good job of showing the big picture. Before you say anything, this is data for just the US because I can't find comparable data for the global market, but I think the overall story is basically the same on a global basis. What you see here is that 1999 was the peak of the music industry, and then Napster came along and popped that bubble overnight. As you can see, it was downhill from there for a very long time, basically until 2014 when streaming revenue starts to get to a decent size. Then in 2015, which is when Apple came out with Apple Music, that's when streaming revenue really explodes and turns things around. Basically, piracy did two things simultaneously. On the one hand, it made it much easier to discover new artists, but then on the other hand, it also made it much harder for artists to monetize their music. And for the major label system, that was catastrophic. You can see how it decimated their revenue for 15 years. For those artists, they were plugged into the mainstream media ecosystem of radio, TV, magazines, and all that. For them, getting discovered wasn't a problem. They had that part of it covered, so their goal was to monetize. And piracy made monetizing music way harder than it was in the pre-Napster era. So, as I said before, I don't blame them one bit for hating piracy as much as they did. It definitely affected their bottom line. But on the other hand, for indie and DIY artists, I think piracy helped them much more than it hurt them. Because for these artists, getting discovered is their biggest challenge. Of course, every artist would like to make money from their music, but making money is kind of a moot point if nobody even knows you exist, right? And piracy has always helped people discover new artists, whether that was through tape trading, through Limewire, or through those top 10 brutal deathcore breakdowns that go hard videos on YouTube. But anyway, what it comes down to is that if you're a well-known artist who wants to monetize your music, you have good reason to hate piracy. But if you're an indie artist who just wants to get the word out, you probably don't care too much about piracy and you might even embrace it. And as you can see in this chart, things have definitely turned around in a big way over the last few years. Music industry is way up, and it's all thanks to streaming. And I actually think piracy was a key step to getting us to the streaming era because it showed us what people want in terms of consuming music. They want on-demand access to basically everything. And then once Spotify and Apple figured out the right way to deliver that experience, the market responded and the industry rebounded.
One of the companies I'm closely involved with now called Spotify, which is in Stockholm. It's really, really, really cool. It's the realization of the dream that Fanny and I had with Napster.
So anyway, like I said in the intro, I don't think this video could have been made until now because the story wasn't complete. We hadn't yet arrived in the streaming world, so if I had made this video in 2013, I would have said very different things. I would have painted a much darker picture. I would have probably had a much more negative opinion of piracy. But here we are in the post-Spotify and Apple Music world where, in my opinion, it's a better time than ever to be not only a fan of music, but also to be an independent musician. And in a weird way, I don't think we would have gotten here without piracy. All right, guys, that's it for me. That's my 2 cents on how piracy and then later on streaming have both helped and hurt the industry at the same time. So let me know what you think about that whole idea of piracy, like bringing the industry to the brink of death, but then also creating the habits that would lead to streaming that resurrected it and made it, in my opinion, better than ever. Let me know if you guys agree with that or if you think I'm just totally full of shit and making things up. Let me know in the comments. I would also love to hear some fun stories about the glory days of music piracy. Did you get any viruses off Limewire and Kazaa? Were you there for Napster? Were you into like the obscure ones like Direct Connect and Audiogalaxy? Or were you an even bigger nerd like me? Were you into IRC and Usenet? And lastly, if you like this video or any of my other videos, I would love it if you give me a follow over on Instagram. I'm putting a lot more effort into my content over there lately, so there's a link in the description. I would love a follow. And with that, I'm gonna sign off for now, but I will see you next time.